first of all, I'd like to tell you that I already knew you before you were famous.
Now, how did you manage that?
Yeah, you co-authored some articles on fiction and empathy.
Oh, yes, with Raymond Marr.
Raymond Marr and Keith Oatley.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, so you knew those?
I know them and I know the articles.
Oh, how nice.
Yeah, because I cited them in my dissertation.
What was your dissertation on?
It was on literature and empathy.
Aha.
Yeah.
Aha. So, well, it turns out literature is good for something.
It is,
which is, likely why we read it and talk about it and tell stories and watch movies and do all those sorts of things.
Yeah. That would be my first question. What do you find interesting about that fiction and empathy topic?
Well, it's a matter of mimicry. For me to feel empathy for you, I have to see the world through your eyes. And I do that with my body. What I do, technically, is I attempt to determine what your goal is. And I do that by observing your nonverbal behavior substantially, your verbal behavior as well, especially the direction of your eyes. And I get some sense of what you're focused on as a consequence of that. And because of that, I can also focus on that. And if I do the same thing, then my body reacts the same way yours does, in which case I feel emotions that are similar to yours. And then I can understand you. And so when you go to a movie or you read a piece of literature, you focus on the protagonist or whatever, or the series of protagonists, and you identify their goals. And by identifying their goals, you can place yourself in the same state of mind that they are. And then you can embody their emotions. It's not a cognitive process. It's an embodied process. And then you can read off your emotions and infer what they might be thinking. And then that gives you the opportunity to see the world from the perspective of other people, which you need to do if you're going to cooperate and compete with them successfully. And so literature, storytelling, not literature specifically, but storytelling and all of the dramatic arts are there precisely to facilitate that understanding. That's why children pretend play so often and so naturally. They adopt roles to become other people so that they can understand each other. It's crucially important. And one of the things that I'm concerned about is the fact that our modern technologies, especially phones, because they're so ubiquitous, are likely interfering with children's ability to engage in sufficient dramatic play. And because of that, it's destabilizing their identities. I often wonder if these adolescents who are having gender role confusion, and say, let's call it identity confusion in general, are doing something like delayed pretend play because they didn't get it when they were young. And it's not optional. It's crucial. There's about a 4-year period from about the age of, let's say, 3 till 7 or 8, where you need to engage in continual dramatic play. And that's what catalyzes your identity, enables you to practice who you're going to be. And if that's interfered with, well, we have no idea what the consequences of that will be. I would say social isolation to begin with, because a kid that can't play, is hopeless socially. You're hopeless socially unless you can play. And you need that early.
I'd like to get back to this later, but perhaps first for our Dutch viewers who don't know you yet, how would you introduce yourself?
Well, I'm a psychologist and a researcher and a professor and an author and a business consultant and a speaker. And I don't know if that's the proper order. I have a family, I have a wife and children. That's me. I've become notorious or well-known because of my YouTube presence. I don't know exactly how you characterize someone like that. A media personality, a new media personality, I suppose. I have a very popular podcast and a very popular YouTube channel with 2 million subscribers and 1 million Twitter followers and 500,000 Facebook followers, and it's some insane number of social media contacts, and I've learned how to use that, I suppose, to some degree over the last 4 or 5 years, and
it's
exploded.
What?
Well, I mean, what I used it for to begin with, YouTube, was to put my lectures online because they were popular and because there was some interest from television stations in Canada, a small television station, and they were a small hit by the standards of such things. And I thought, well, there's YouTube. I don't know what the hell YouTube is for. How about I record my lectures and put them on YouTube and see what happens? Maybe I can teach thousands of people instead of dozens of people, and why not? So I set up an iPad and a lapel mic, for $200 and started to record my lectures. And they became very popular even before all the political scandal enveloped me. And then, well, in 2016, I objected to legislation that was brought in by the Canadian federal government, had already been brought in by the provincial governments, mandating certain forms of, not only certain forms of speech, but certain forms of conceptualization about what constitutes sex and gender. And I felt that it was unconscionable. There was no scientific justification for it. There is no logical justification for it. It's a completely incoherent doctrine and policy. I think it's dangerous beyond belief. I think it's an incredible intrusion on free speech. I know that the legislation is unprecedented in British common law history. And I also know that in the United States, the Supreme Court in 1942, I believe, expressly forbade precisely what the Canadian federal government did in 2016. And so because I objected to that, I got myself in a tremendous amount of political trouble because people assumed that I was bigoted against trans people and racist and homophobic and all the other things that you're tarred and feathered with if you dare to have an opinion that varies from the noisy virtue signaling minority. And after that, I think partly because I already had 300 YouTube videos up, things just exploded around me. And also I published a book in January of 2018, which added to the 2018? Yes, 2018, which it added to the general racket, let's say. And I found myself in a very strange position, traveling the world, I've traveled to 160 cities in the last year and spoken to about 350,000 people about personal responsibility and the meaning that is to be found in not in rights, but in responsibility. And no one seems to be talking about that for reasons I don't understand. And so people are starving to hear that, also for reasons I don't understand. So that's the situation now. And it's a very odd life. Although my name is not, I would say, particularly positive among certain elements of the press. I'm accused of all sorts of things that have absolutely nothing to do with what I believe. But my normal life, such as it is continually punctuated by encounters with people on the street, dozens a day if I go outside, of people who tell me that they've watched my videos, they listen to my podcasts, they read my book, they were in desperate straits 6 months ago, they're doing much better. And so they're thankful about that and help and pleased that someone is offering them an encouraging word. Because I actually happen to be rather positively predisposed to people. And I think that's rare because in our culture we believe that we're something like a cancer on the planet, and that our activity is unconscionably destructive, and that the best thing we could do is to cease having children and make ourselves scarce. And I think that that's a viewpoint that's cruel and vicious and resentful and appalling, and I buy none of it. We do the best we can under very difficult circumstances, and we're only barely waking up to our planetary responsibilities and not doing such a bad job for people who've only figured it out 50 years ago. So I'm trying to offer people some encouragement for their trouble. And they seem in staggeringly desperate need of that.
This touches you, right? This makes
well,
you...
it's very peculiar and difficult to accustom myself to meeting endless parades of strangers everywhere in the world who tell me a desperate story with a happy ending. It's a very private story, and they obviously trust me enough to, first of all, tell me what was wrong, and then let me in on the fact that things have improved dramatically because they've developed a vision for their life, and because they've decided to marry their girlfriend, and because they've decided to have a family, finally, and to settle down, and to work at their career, even though they may just have a job, and to tell the truth, and that's working. And so they're very pleased about that. And so, maybe, I don't know what the proper reaction to receiving information like that on a rather random basis is, but it's not nothing.
We've met some of your fans, and we got the impression they were all male fans, the ones that we talked to, and that they were struggling with their manhood, and that you give them this message that it's okay to be a man.
It's not okay. It's necessary. What the hell are we going to do without men? You look around the city here, you see all these buildings go up, these men, they're doing impossible things. They're under the streets, working on the sewers, they're up on the power lines, in the storms and the rain. They're keeping this impossible infrastructure functioning, this thing that works in a miraculous manner. They work themselves to death, and often literally, and the gratitude for that is sorely lacking, especially among the people who should be most grateful. You see university professors, especially of the social justice bent, who are among the most protected and privileged people that the world has ever produced. They take everything they have for granted, failing to understand entirely that there's a massive infrastructure of unbelievably hardworking, solidly laboring, working class men breaking themselves in half on a regular basis, making sure that everything that always breaks works. And so a little gratitude for that is in order. And it's very useful to tell everyone, not just men, that they have an important role to play, a necessary role, and that if they act properly and honestly and forthrightly, that they can put their lives together, and they can help their families, and they can make their communities better, and that's not toxic masculinity, that appalling phrase. It's what keeps the world going round. And if we had any sense, we'd understand that, instead of doing everything at every possible moment to label what we have in the West as oppressive and patriarchal and fundamentally predicated on power, of all the insane propositions. Anybody who's ever worked for a functional organization knows perfectly well that the organization isn't predicated on power. You have a boss who's whose fundamental motivation is power, well, first of all, the probability that he's going to be successful is very low because everyone will be working against him behind the scenes. The people who are successful are good mentors, and they're hard workers, and they're productive, and they're competent, and they do their job properly, and they do everything they can. My observation has been that they do everything they can to find junior colleagues who have potential and possibility and work diligently to further their careers, and find that a major, if not the major, source of satisfaction in their life. Certainly the people I've met in my life who've been very successful, and I've met many very successful people, are thrilled to death when they can find someone who's young and willing and able and conscientious and straightforward and diligent, and they open doors for them in every direction they can possibly manage. And none of that's credited to the oppressive capitalist patriarchal system, which also is doing miracles, is performing miraculously all around the world, raising the standard of living of poor people everywhere in the world at a rate that's unprecedented in human history. The UN itself, which I would hardly regard as a pro-capitalist organization, believes that absolute poverty will be eradicated by the year 2030 in its totality. It's been halved since between 2000 and 2012. We're moving rapidly towards a post-poverty world economy where no one is starving except for political reasons. And there's no gratitude for that either.
You think capitalism is?
There's absolutely no doubt about it. It's the collapse of the Soviet Union and the catastrophic economic policies that the communists implemented, especially in places like South America and Africa. And the burden of that has been lifted at least slightly. And so we start to see some semi-sane economic policies that reward people for their own entrepreneurial productivity and provide them with a modicum of security. And we're producing surpluses in every possible direction. Free electronic communication for everyone in the world, rapid dissemination of fresh water and sanitation facilities, markedly reduced child mortality, which is now in sub-Saharan Africa down to the same levels it was in Europe in 1952. It's an absolute miracle, and no one's aware of it. And it's to be laid at the feet of the dissemination of the idea of individual sovereignty and free market principles around the world. And if you dare to put yourself forward as a spokesperson for the poor, you could do nothing better but to hope that we make everybody on the damn planet as rich as we possibly can as quickly as possible, because the evidence also suggests that as soon as you get people's as soon as you get the GDP of a country up above $5,000 a year, then people start to take care of the environment. And so you see in places like China and in India, there are more forests now than there were 30 years ago. There's more forests in the Northern Hemisphere than there were 100 years ago. There's all sorts of things even on the biological front that are positive in ways that people don't know about. It's not to say we don't have our troubles. I would say the oceans are overfished badly, and that's a big mistake, but that's a tragedy of the commons. But most things are far better than they've ever been, and there's so little gratitude for that it's a form of incomprehensible miracle to me.
In our documentary, we're focusing on male-female relations in Canada and in the West, and on feminism. So I'd like to get back to that point, because that was one of the things that you mentioned. Do you think that men are having a more difficult time today than women?
Oh, that's very hard to say. I don't think men are encouraged. I think they're discouraged actively right from day one. Whether that makes them have a harder time than women is very difficult to say. I think those things are best judged on an individual level. I mean, I was thinking about, and then if you think about it historically, well, it's 2019. Well, imagine 1919. Well, that would have been 4 years of a terrible war with tens of thousands of people dead, and then the Spanish influenza. It could be a hell of a lot worse than it is now. And so we have our problems. I think the most serious is a form of strange political polarization that threatens, to some degree, that seems to threaten the stability of our political systems and the civility of our society. But, it depends on your grounds of comparison. It's not like we're starving. It's not like we're in the middle of a plague. There's no civil war. Things could be a hell of a lot worse. But there's a pernicious social viciousness that's emerged over the last 10 years that I think is disheartening to people, and it would be nice if that would dissipate, and perhaps it will. Perhaps people will gain their senses and stop causing unnecessary trouble. I mean, it's not surprising to me to some degree. We have a technical problem. And the technical problem fundamentally is that the birth control pill radically altered the relationship between men and women. It turned women into creatures who did not know who they were. And unsurprisingly, because an entire plethora of new options opened up, and it destabilized the relationship between men and women for the same reason. And it's not easy to understand the new dynamic that should or could emerge as a consequence of women having voluntary control over their reproduction. So to me, it's in large part the male-female issue is the upheaval of something that's the equivalent of a major biological mutation. So we've had 40 years to figure that out. It's like we haven't figured it out. I think that we've also compounded that by doing almost nothing but lying to young women, because that's all we do to young women. We tell them that, well, first of all, that career is the most important thing in life, which there is no evidence whatsoever that that's true. If you look at standard public opinion polls, you find that 75% of people regard their family and their friends as the most important part of their lives.
Men as well.
Men as well, yes. It's the social, well, Jesus, most careers aren't careers, they're jobs. How many bloody people have a career? And even if you have a career, what makes you think it's worth giving up a family for? What are you going to do when you're 50 and 60 and 70 and you're alone? And believe me, there's going to be plenty of people facing that. And, so it's no solution. And to tell young women that their fundamental orientation in life is going to be a career is a complete lie. It's not only not true conceptually, because that isn't how people are oriented, but it's untrue demographically, because what happens to the vast majority of women, even professional women, is that when they hit their 30s, their early 30s, they cut back radically on their career commitments and start to focus on having a family. And no bloody wonder, because, well, you better get at it. That's the first thing, because 30's pushing it. And second, well, what makes you think that your job is so all-consuming and meaningful? You mostly get paid to do things that you don't want to do, which is why you get paid for them. There's this tiny fraction of people who have hyper-interesting creative careers, and they're a tremendously tiny proportion of the population. And even those people, it isn't obvious to me, have lives that are better served by their extraordinary careers than they would be served by normative family arrangements. And you need people, you need an intimate partner, you need children and grandchildren. These aren't optional. And to tell young women that that's part of the propaganda of the oppressive patriarchy is, you could hardly do them a more cruel disservice. And they will discover that when they're 30. You know, it's why the law firms lose all their women in their 30s. They all go and take part-time jobs or work 9 to 5. They're not interested in the C-suite. Do you know how goddamn hard you have to work to be a C-suite executive? It's 80 hours a week. I know some insane men that work in the C-suite, you know, and the mystery isn't why there are few women in the C-suite. The mystery is why there are any men at all in the C-suite, because all they do is work. And they have a tremendous amount of responsibility. And you think, well, they have many millions of dollars and they have their yachts and their freedom. And, that's trust fund people or people who are benefiting from unearned oil revenue in the Middle East, the parasitical rich, let's say, who aren't productive. But most of the people who occupy themselves in business have thousands of employees that they're responsible for and unbelievably heavy responsibilities. And they pay a huge price for that because all they do is work. Now, some men in particular, and some women, but a fewer proportion of women, some men are wired like that. And wherever you put them, they're going to work 80 hours a week because they're hyper-conscientious and it's in their nature. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend it as a recipe for a balanced life, even though the rest of us might be reasonably pleased that there are at least some people who are willing to do that. But to think of that as a target for ambition it's just not realistic for the vast majority of people. Who wants that? Why would you want to work 80 hours a week? It's exactly what, I know this. I worked with female lawyers for a decade, high-performing female lawyers. And all of them woke up at 29 or 30 once they'd made partner and thought, what the hell am I doing? I'm working constantly. I mean, the salaries were very good. The level of income was very high, but they were usually married to men who also had very good incomes because those two things tend to correlate very highly. Women generally marry men who have incomes who are higher than theirs. They're thinking, well, how about if I have a life? Which is a perfectly reasonable question. And so, but a lot of it's confusion. But what I also don't understand, especially from the feminists, is that if the goddamn oppressive male patriarchy is such a hellish structure bent on the oppression and domination of everyone in the world, why in the world are women encouraged to flock into it and occupy all the positions of power? That makes no sense to me at all. Is it supposed to be magically transformed in its oppressive nature merely because women happen to be doing exactly the same jobs that men were? Are the women magical in some sense and are going to decrease the degree to which the oppressiveness occurs? There's no evidence for that. That women who have male bosses are happier on average than women who have female bosses. The data, the psychological data on that are quite clear. So there's no evidence that women run more compassionate or efficient organizations than men. And I don't know why you would expect them to, because men and women are more the same than they are different, even though the differences aren't trivial. So, and the idea that there are no differences between men and women, which is the standard social constructionist line, is only indicative of an ignorance of biology that's so profound that it should be criminal. So there's many differences between men and women, and morphologically, physiologically, psychologically, temperamentally, hormonally, developmentally, right from in utero exposure to different sex hormones. And these are not trivial matters, and they have not a determining effect, but a crucial effect. And you see these especially manifested in the extremes, which is why, for example, that the rates of incarceration of men are 10 to 15 times those of women. That's not sociological. It's because there's a small proportion of men who are hyper-aggressive, and you can identify them when they're 2. So, the social constructionists, Judith Butler and people like that, they know absolutely nothing about biology. Nothing. And their ignorance of biology is so profound that they don't even think that they need to know anything about biology because it's not real. It's all a social construct. And it's It does no one any good. We know in the Scandinavian countries, here's a statistic. The freer the country, the fewer women in the STEM fields. Now explain that. It's easy. If you allow women their choice, they go into professions that care for people. If you allow men their choice, they go into professions that deal with things. And the freer the society, the more that happens. And so the Scandinavians are in this strange position where they've maximally freed their sexes by introducing socially egalitarian legislation. And one of the fundamental consequences is that the differences between men and women in Scandinavia are bigger than they are anywhere else in the world, both in terms of occupational choice and personality. And the Scandinavians have no idea what to do about that. It was a shock to everyone, including the psychologists who discovered it. But what are we going to do? We're going to force little boys and little girls to be exactly the same? We're going to set up a huge bureaucracy to start to hyper-socialize them when they're tiny so that they become identical in every way by the time they're adults? You really think that's going to work? You have to be arrogant beyond conception and cruel to think that such a policy would be either viable or reasonably implemented.
Jordan, you're touching on a lot of things right now, and there are some things that I have some arguments for, but I'd like to separate a few things and try to get a few things clearer from you. And one of them is, it sounds when I hear you talking that you would be in favor for a more traditional gender role division. Is that true?
Well, no, not necessarily, but I'm certainly in favor of a more traditional familial structure. It's like, have some damn kids. What are you going to do with your life?
What's the difference between a more traditional familiar structure and a more traditional gender role division?
Well, perhaps we can set it up so that men have the opportunity to spend more time with their kids. Now exactly how we're going to do that isn't obvious, because it seems to me that men are not well equipped to take care of infants under a year old. I don't see that they're good at that at all. That's been my experience and my observation. And
your own experience?
Well, no, but my observation as well. But men get better at it as the children get older, and they're perfectly capable of establishing extremely tight relationships with their kids, especially, I think, after they're old enough to start to engage in rough and tumble play, which starts to happen really after about 9 months. The men can really start to step in. In my view, I think that for the first year of life, of a child's life, the woman's role is to take care of the baby, and the man's role is to take care of the woman and the baby, and to step in and to stop her from becoming exhausted and to make sure that things go smoothly. And then the couple can negotiate the roles after that and make them as egalitarian as they want or can manage. And there's nothing wrong with having men deeply involved in their family structures. It's to their benefit. Clearly, the most detrimental predictor of poor long-term outcome for children is fatherlessness. And of course, that's something no one will talk about either, because, well, every family's the same and it doesn't matter if you have a father. Well, it turns out to bloody well matter a lot, because if you don't have a father, you're far more likely to become pregnant as a teenage girl. You hit puberty earlier. You're way more likely to be alcoholic. Your rates of mental illness go through the roof. And if you have sons, they're far more likely to be criminal, incarcerated, and drug addicted. And it's not a trivial effect. And so men are necessary in families, and the more time they spend with their children, proper time, the better. And so that's not exactly traditional. I'm not suggesting that women stay home with the babies constantly and have 10 of them while the men go off to work like they did 40 years ago, or say 60 years ago. There's more intelligent ways of organizing a family, but we should get our priorities straight. And a birth rate of 1.2 or whatever it is that we have that characterizes the Western world at the moment is not. It's the sign of a very unhealthy society. It's the sign of a society that's lost the idea of the divinity of the Virgin Mother and the child. And it's not a good thing. So, and I don't see any evidence that it's improved people's qualities of life. All of the demographic evidence suggests that women have become increasingly unhappy since the early 1960s. So, the cross-sectional studies continually conducted year after year show precisely that. And it could easily be because they're taking on more and more responsibility. You think, well, you have a career and it's fulfilling and all of that, but it's not just fulfilling, it's stressful and difficult. And if you have a career and a family, especially if you're a single mother, well, good luck to you, man. You're run off your feet nonstop, and you're a target for every predatory male in the neighborhood. It's not a pleasant mode of existence, and it's not one I would recommend for people, even though there are many single mothers who do, heroic work, doing the best they can for their families, but they're completely overwhelmed. You can't work and have kids and be single? How the hell could you do that? It's 2 full-time jobs, at least, and that's only if you have 1 kid. So, and we don't know how to solve a lot of these problems because it turns out that having children is very expensive, and farming them out to daycare doesn't make economic sense. You can do the calculations on the back of an envelope and figure that out in about 15 minutes if you're vaguely arithmetically inclined and would actually like to know the facts. So, you need a trained childcare worker, so that's maybe $45,000 a year. You have to double that for overhead. That includes the buildings and the rest of the structure, especially if the children are young. So that's $90,000 a year. Well, and then if you have young children, the largest number of children that you can place with a caregiver is 3, possibly 4, but if they're young enough, let's say 3, that's $30,000 a child. Well, that's post-tax money. Well, if you have 2 children, how many people make enough money to spend $60,000 a year having someone else take care of their children? And that problem isn't going to go away. You're going to hire untrained workers to take care of the children. You're going to have substandard physical infrastructure to provide them with. No one's figured that out economically.
Well, the Scandinavians seem to have figured it out with cheap childcare or even state-funded childcare. And also a paternal leave that's divided.
And what's their birth rate?
Well, but why is that so important, the birth rate? Because it's.
Well, I don't know. What's so important? I mean, that's part of the question. Yeah. Well, what's important? Well, children are important, and 1 isn't enough.
No.
First of all, we don't even know if children can be raised on their own. I mean, how? We don't know.
I was raised on my much on my own.
Well, I mean, it happens, but the natural human environment is for children to be surrounded by other children, and we have no idea how much socialization occurs as a consequence of having siblings. You think, well, you're raised by your parents. It's like, no, not in a standard human environment. Mostly, you're raised by your siblings and your friends, and if you don't have any siblings, then what does that do to you? Well, you don't know, and no one knows. But it makes you different than you would otherwise be. I would say one of the things that it's likely to do is to make you substantially more narcissistic than you would otherwise be. And that's obviously no slur on you. But, siblings keep each other in place. And they teach you how to interact under very competitive conditions with other people. And they play with you, and they're role models for you. And, we don't know if a structure of 2 parents and 1 child is stable or healthy. We know nothing about that. And my suspicions are that it's not, because children need other children. So
now we do see that the Scandinavian countries, and I don't include Holland in that, people tend to include Holland,
yeah.
But I don't think we are a Scandinavian country, that they score highest on happiness, so they must do something right.
Well, they're rich.
But there are also other rich countries, but then...
Yes, and most of the rich countries score quite high on happiness. The Scandinavians do particularly well, but the difference between them and the Canadians and the Americans and so forth isn't that great. I mean, they are actually quite staggeringly rich, especially the Norwegians, since they have all their oil money. And so there's multiple reasons why their societies are stable. They're also homogenous countries in the large, which also seems to be something that contributes to the stability of communities, according to the work of Robert Putnam from Harvard. And they're small countries, and they're relatively easy to govern. And so there's multiple reasons why the Scandinavians might be doing well. And their egalitarian policies are perhaps part of it. But it takes careful analysis to pull those things apart.
Yeah,
and measuring happiness is no straightforward thing either. And I would say that their alcoholism rates are relatively high. So
it's a complex question.
Yeah,
I know I studied psychology.
It is. It's a complicated question, and the Scandinavians. But I wouldn't underestimate the degree to which general economic prosperity and a relative heterogeneity or homogeneity of social expectation is a major contributor.
But I'm just trying to find out, do you or do you not think that gender equality is also something that leads to happiness, that makes couples happier?
Well, it depends on what you mean by equality.
Well,
if you mean, well, the equality is a very complicated word because people use it to signify equality of outcome, which I think is absolutely an appalling concept, or they use it to signify equality of opportunity. And equality of opportunity means set your society up so those who have the talent have the untrammeled ability to express it. Well, great. Anyone with any sense, even if they were greedy, would agree with that. I mean, if you're talented, let's say you're a great musician. Well, I'd just as soon you had the chance to show that because maybe I could listen to your music. You have to be a fool not to be in favor of equality of opportunity. Talent is in short supply, and we need to encourage it wherever we can possibly discover it, independent of race, creed, and color, and gender, and all of those things, sex. And so people shouldn't hide their light under a bushel. We've known that forever. But then to equate that with equality of outcome and to say that, well, because there are differences in, let's say, the sex representation by sex at different strata of different organizations, that's a consequence of some sort of fundamental sociological oppression is an entirely different argument, as well as being different than the argument that all of the outcomes should in fact be the same if the society was equal, because there's no evidence that men and women given free choice will choose the same outcomes. And why would they? I mean, look, here's a question. Diversity, inclusivity, equity, the triumvirate, right? The modern triumvirate. Equity is equality of outcome. Okay, let's talk about diversity. Are people different or not? Well, if they're diverse and diversity is worth pursuing, then people are different. Or they're not. It's one or the other. So if they're diverse, they're different. Well, if they're different, if you let them manifest their diversity, you're not going to get equality of outcome. It's so incoherent that it defies comprehension. It's like if people were the same, well, then you get equality of outcome. And if they were the same, then you wouldn't have to worry about diversity. But if they're different, importantly different, culturally or biologically, whatever the reasons you happen to come up with, and you leave them be, they're going to pursue their individual, idiosyncratic, diverse interests, and that's going to produce an entire plethora of unequal outcomes. And in fact, we mostly work for unequal outcomes. You have a career, you picked a specific career. You don't expect to be absolutely equal with everyone else on every single parameter because you specialized in something and you're hoping that you can develop some expertise that ratchets you up a competence hierarchy so that you're good for something and so that you have some opportunities. And that's all associated with unequal outcomes as well. And there's supposed to be something bad about that? It's like it's what we're striving for. It doesn't mean that people are happy when they walk down the street and see a homeless person lying there, half frozen to death and alcoholic in their sleeping bag. No one wants that. But those problems are very difficult to solve. You think, well, it's an economic problem. It's like, not usually. It's usually a mental illness problem, or it's an addiction problem, or most commonly it's an alcoholism problem. And throwing money at that is not going to help. So, we have these hyper simplified solutions for problems that are so complex that fools leap in where angels fear to tread. And we associate poverty with lack of money. And that's both the conservatives and the liberals do that. And it's the height of hypersimplification because people's problems are far more complicated than their mere economic difficulties. It would be lovely. I was thinking about this the other day when I was writing. It would be lovely to believe that the 1%, who control the world's resources are somehow protected in some fundamental way against the catastrophes and tragedies of existence. But they're not. You meet people who are well off, you know. They have a buffer. It's better than to be poverty-stricken. It's certainly better than to be homeless. But the relationship between happiness and income comes to a halt at about middle-class level. And I don't care how much money you have, you're still going to get Alzheimer's disease. You're still going to get cancer. The people that you love are still going to die. You're still going to fight with your children. You're still going to divorce your spouse. I mean, you're not protected nearly as well by your money as everybody would like to hope. You know, and that's actually rather sad, because wouldn't it be lovely if we could have 1% of the population who are actually in a glass bubble protected from the catastrophes of life, and at least other people could strive for that. But it's nowhere near that simple.
Now again, we have to separate a few things, because I'm going to get some water. Because every time you're touching upon a lot of different things, so it's also difficult for me to choose what I'm reacting to.
No problem.
So, I heard you say this before, that when you were confronted with several facts of women being oppressed in the past, that you say, well, that's an awful story to tell young men. This really gets to you. Why
well,
is
everybody's
that so?
bloody oppressed in the past. Jesus, human history is a complete catastrophic nightmare. The more you read it, the more horrified you become. It's like the vast majority of people killed in wars are men. The vast majority of people who are killed in dangerous jobs are men. It's not like either of us had an easy time. I mean, the huge problem for women prior to the 20th century was death in childbirth. At least we got that under control. You know, and you could say, well, women didn't have all the rights that men had for quite a substantial amount of time, but it wasn't like most men had rights. Christ, what percentage of Eastern Europeans were serfs until 1850? The vast majority of people in the feudal ages were essentially slaves. The men didn't have any rights. Most men didn't get the vote until very late. And, you know, women got it afterwards, but not that many decades afterwards. And to construe the history of the human race as the pervasive oppression of women by men it's a story invented by women who have never had a satisfactory relationship with a single man in their entire life. Not a brother, not a father, not a husband, not a son, nothing. Because if they had a satisfactory relationship, they would not be driving that narrative forward.
You really do believe that?
I absolutely. Why would I not believe it? What's the counter evidence?
Well, the counter evidence are all those facts that women
What
used
facts?
to have less rights, like
Yeah, but
also
yes, but
owning
you're
property.
looking at tiny periods of history. You
Tiny.
know, for the vast majority of human history, most people were slaves, men and women. There were very few free people. And then in the West, you know, since the Enlightenment, a small and increasingly large percentage of men started to develop a certain amount of freedom. And that spread very rapidly over the period of over a minimum number of hundreds of years. It spread, I think, as fast as it possibly could have, given all of the things that have to happen in order for that kind of equality to manifest itself. And we don't even know what the preconditions are for that equality. You can walk down the street in Holland safely. No. Compared to most places in the world, you can walk down the streets in Holland safely. Most of the places in the world, you can't walk down the streets safely. Well, how long does it take to establish a society that's civilized and sophisticated enough so that one of the primary hallmarks of your freedom would be the ability merely to walk somewhere unaccompanied?
You say we should be thankful. Women should be thankful.
I didn't say women should be thankful. I said people should be thankful that we've managed these things and that we freed so many people in such a short time. You know, the social constructionists, their view of history is 300 years long, if that. Usually it's more like a decade. You look at this over any reasonable period of time, that freedom is spread among people so rapidly, especially in the last 500 years, that it's an absolute bloody miracle. You know, most men didn't have the vote 150 years ago. So we're looking at very small periods of time. And the proclivity for freedom to spread and for equality to spread is very, very powerful. And there's virtually no one opposing it. You know, I mean, in the span of a single lifetime, it seems like things are progressing rather slowly, but from a cultural perspective, the rate of change is so fast that that we can barely keep up with it. And I don't believe for a moment that the typical woman has fewer opportunities now than the typical man. I don't see that that's true at all. I don't think the facts support I certainly don't think the facts support that that's true. Women are outperforming men at every level of the economic hierarchy. You know, they don't do as well economically once they graduate, but that's partly because of the majors they determine to take and because of the choices they make with regards to their career strategies. So this narrative of oppression it's so resentful and so ungrateful and so unrealistic and so historically ignorant that it's a miracle to me that people can swallow it. Human history is simple. Things were terrible before 1895. Terrible. The average person in the West lived on less than $1 a day in today's money, which is half the current rate that the UN regards as abject poverty, right? You were going to be pregnant from the time you were 14 till the time you were 30, and the chances are that you were going to live through that was like 0. Your parents were going to be dead, at least one of them. You were going to lose at least half your children. You're going to spend the vast majority of your time in back-breaking work. Your life was hard in a way that modern people can barely imagine. And there's been an economic miracle of unparalleled significance in the last 150 years. And we have so much more than we had then that the world isn't even vaguely the same. And yet we read backwards and we say, well, men were privileged. Which bloody men were privileged? Exactly. I mean, let's get down to the nuts and bolts of it. Who were privileged? The serfs who tilled the land? The knights who defended the feudal communities? The kings, perhaps, although I'm not so sure you would have wanted to live in a drafty and freezing castle with no plumbing or electricity or heating or entertainment through ice-cold winters with the constant threat of war. The men went off to war constantly. There were endless numbers of devastating plagues. No one had enough to eat. It's like, and now what are we doing? We're quibbling about whether men or women had a rougher time. It's like, Jesus, you know. And what? There was no cooperation between men and women? What's that? Men help raise children. Do you know how rare that is in the mammalian community? It's almost unheard of. And they actually do a pretty good job. Most men love their children. And so where's the oppression? Some temporary imbalance in rights. As the idea that universal human suffrage was an appropriate idea slowly manifested itself from about 1500 onward, eradicating slavery, bringing in universal suffrage over a very short period of time. 5 100-year-old men. That's the span of time we're talking about. And now we have this narrative that men were fundamentally oppressing women since the beginning of time. It's like, here's a question for you. Answer this. Marriage is a patriarchal institution. That goes along with the patriarchal oppression narrative. Okay, fine. Why do rich women marry? Because they're the only ones that do. Because marriage is now a privilege reserved for the rich. And if you're married, you're much less likely to separate. You're much more likely to have a stable family. You're much more likely to have a stable income, especially if you're a woman. If you fall down the economic chain, you have a series of short-term relationships, most of them involving people living together. You're much more likely to separate. You're much more likely to end up alone. And so if marriage is a patriarchal institution, then why are the rich engaging in it?
Okay, let me, because we don't have a lot of time, I can't really pursue this further. I would like to, because I could, of course, go into the fact that right now it's not a patriarchal institution anymore because women do have equal rights, and in the past, women used to get fired when they got married and all of this sort of stuff. But I'm not going to go into that, because we need to shift to another topic. Because what we're also looking at here...
well, that mostly happened in the 1950s. That wasn't even true for most of the 20th century.
All right, but let's not go into that further. Because we're looking at how it could be that Canada has had 2 incidents of anti-feminist violence. The attack at the Polytechnique College and the Toronto van attack, of course.
Yes.
So you lived in Montreal, and I was wondering if you, when you first heard about the Montreal massacre, how was that for you?
Well, there's no shortage of insane and resentful men, you know, and they strike innocence in all sorts of different ways. There's the same pathological thought processes characterize the people who shoot up elementary schools or high schools. You know, there are people who brood and dwell on their failures and their resentment and their rejection by the general social community, and often by people of the opposite sex, but often by people of the same sex, even with friendships. And they sit in their basements or in their you know, in the hellholes they've created for themselves, and they fantasize about taking revenge on the world for the inequities that have been delivered upon them. And then they act, and they're very rare, and they're very unpredictable, and we don't know what to do about them. And they gather a tremendous amount of press coverage and notoriety for their actions, and that's part of what drives it. It's a terrible thing, but it isn't a problem that we know how to solve, because we can't identify the precursors and we can't stop the publicity. So it's terrible. I don't think that there's any evidence that that particular form of appalling insanity is more frequently directed contra-sexually than generally.
Yeah, but we're looking at these 2 attacks. So
yeah,
perhaps
well, those are terrible attacks.
And, interpretation of why it happened here in Canada.
No.
You don't?
I don't. Well, certainly not in a place like Montreal. I mean, well, or Toronto for that matter. They're pretty civilized cities. I mean, I don't think you can find a safer city anywhere in the world for women than Toronto and Montreal. Christ, in Montreal, you can walk around, if you're female, you can walk around unaccompanied everywhere all the time, and virtually you're as safe as you are anywhere in the world. It's the same in Toronto. So there's no explaining fundamentally rare and random acts. You know, this incel character. I mean, I was interviewed in the New York Times about that, and I made a comment that monogamous societies tend to be more stable, which is an absolutely obvious anthropological finding that everyone who's even vaguely educated has known for at least 100 years. And the reporter made much of that, suggesting that I had this idea that, you know, undeserving men should be delivered up women on a platter by some sort of state institutional function, which is not only something that I certainly don't believe, but nobody who's sane has ever believed since the beginning of time. This man who drove over his victims was resentful and full of hatred. And I said that. He had a hatred for God. He had hatred for being. Why? Because he was rejected. I'm not excusing it. It's terrible. There's no excuse for him whatsoever. He should have gone out and made some friends. He should have gone to the gym. He should have put himself together. He should have got educated. You know, I don't know. It's also possible that he had a mental illness that wasn't curable. You know, I mean, there's no shortage of people who are barely clinging to the edges of the world with their fingertips, and now and then one of them slips off and does something terrible. And it's very difficult to draw general conclusions from that, except that such things happen. The only thing I would say about that is that if you're going to perform an act like that, you usually spend many, many months or many, many years fantasizing about it and the notorious aftermath that will glorify your name. And there's nothing in that that's good. And I've never suggested for a moment that men who are rejected by women should do anything but look to themselves and improve themselves so that they make themselves into the kinds of partners who would be voluntarily attractive to women who were making voluntary choices, which is obviously the only sort of solution that's ever going to work anyways. So they're terrible catastrophes. And besides, there's no reason to assume necessarily even that the person who undertook the attack is fully cognizant of their own motives. You know, I mean, we don't trust politicians. I don't know why we'd trust mass murderers to tell us exactly what was going on in their minds the moment before they perpetrated their terrible crime. But I certainly don't think that it reflects specifically on Canadian society. I can't see how that can possibly be true, given that, you know, we're among a handful of countries who are essentially egalitarian in their, not only in their legal structures, but in their entire society. You know, I mean, women saturate the workplace in Canada and have for 40 years, certainly since I've been, especially in the professions that I've occupied. The vast majority of my colleagues and my students have been women. It's par for the course, and it's not a surprise or a shock to anyone, or anything that anyone is complaining about, as far as I can tell. I just think mostly, when I think about it, that it's, well, I find it sad because I've seen so many women, especially in their early 30s, desperate to have children. And I'll tell you that if you want to spend a miserable decade, one good way to do it is to wait till you're 30 to try to have children, and then to find out that you can't. That's no picnic. And your chances at that point, if you're a couple at 30, is 1 in 3 is fertility difficulties, which is defined as unlikelihood of or inability to conceive within 1 year of attempting it. And so I don't know precisely how it is that people go about balancing their requirement for an intimate relationship and a family and their career. It's a very, very difficult problem to solve. Just like how to raise children is a difficult problem to solve because it's so incredibly expensive. I don't know how you solve that economically, because the utility of children economically is deferred decades into the future, and we don't know how to fund that.
I want to get back to the attack again, because of course a lot of people are saying that it's a backlash against feminism, and in the case of the Polytechnique massacre, that was really clear.
Yeah, they say that because it's in their own best political interest. It's 2 bloody people. What are you going to do? You're going to generalize from 2 insane people. When was the Polytechnique massacre? How long ago?
89.
Right, so it's more than 20 years ago. And you had this attack a year ago. It's 2 attacks, 35 million people, 2 attacks in 3 decades. You're going to draw generalized political conclusions from that. And then you're going to assume that those generalized political conclusions aren't a consequence of your own motivations. What's that, a random sample or something? 2 insane people? That's no random sample. There's no drawing conclusions from that. You remember the man who shot up the elementary school in the eastern seaboard in the United States? You're going to draw a conclusion from him? You're going to say something general about society because someone was insane enough to go kill children? You can't do that. You can barely generalize about social trends if you do a random stratified poll. Even those things haven't been accurate recently in predicting political outcomes. So it's all well and good for people who are already grinding an axe to say that these acts are, you know, indicative of widespread attitudes towards women. It's like 2 attacks out of 35 million people in 30 years is not indicative of widespread antipathy towards women.
Now these are 2 attacks, of course, just 2. But you have this huge red pill community online, and you must be familiar with the red pill community.
I'm vaguely familiar with them,
Yeah.
but
So,
what of it?
well, their whole thinking is that feminism is oppressing men.
No, their whole thinking is that radical social justice warriors are polarizing society. And that's exactly what's happening. So you can't accuse the red pill society of holding viewpoints that are even vaguely commensurate with people who commit crimes of that magnitude. There's nothing fair about that at all. It's like painting half the population in the United States. Half the population is Republican, has been for the last 40 years. You know, they tend towards more conservative perspectives on many, many things. It has nothing to do with antipathy towards women, as unless you assume that it's only the liberals that have the best interests of women in mind, and I certainly don't believe that at all. I don't think that the liberals do, especially the radical. I'm not the liberals so much because they're more in the center, but the radical left types, I don't think they have the best interests in women in mind at all. In fact, I don't think they have anybody's best interests in mind. And to identify a vague amalgam of loosely connected people online who discuss in a meme-like fashion being red-pilled with some generalized vicious antipathy towards women, I think there's no evidence for that at all. A tremendous amount of it is merely adolescent trolling. And mainstream media people don't understand what happens online at all. These people, there's plenty of people there who do what they do merely to distract and confuse the mainstream media types who have no idea what the culture actually constitutes. And they do it with incredible effectiveness. They play them for fools all the time. The whole Pepe thing was a perfect example of that. That right-wing conspiracy that was supposed to manifest itself in some, horrible, bloody uprising just vanished as soon as the Trump election was over. So we don't understand these internet communities, and to assume that they're somehow associated with the desire for violence against women is I think there's no evidence for that whatsoever. And certainly I don't think that's the case of the red pill community, such as it is. Most of them are people who were more left-leaning and liberal, who've converted to some degree to a more conservative perspective, mostly because the liberal center keeps moving left and leaving so many people that were once liberal behind. Most of the people who were in the IDW were liberals. Joe Rogan's a liberal as far as he's concerned. Dave Rubin's a liberal as far as he's concerned. Ben Shapiro isn't, but Shapiro's a political pundit, so you can hardly expect it from them. I never thought of myself as a conservative. I'm a social scientist, and I know perfectly well that it's dangerous to experiment on large scale with untested social policies on populations that haven't precisely agreed to the parameters of your experiment, because the probability that you have the diagnosis correct and the answer at hand is zero.
Let's make this more concrete. What is it exactly that you think is so dangerous? What is it exactly that you think is so dangerous?
I think the doctrine of equality of outcome is dangerous.
Can you explain that?
Because it forces all the individuality out of people. It denies the individuality.
What does? Because equality of outcome, of course, is a very
the assumption that, here's the assumption. If at every hierarchical level of every organization, every demographic group is not represented in the same proportion as they're represented in the population, then the reason for that is systemic oppression on the part of the patriarchal of the patriarchy. Let's leave it at that. Well, that's just not the case. Yeah. That isn't the reason for it. And why is it dangerous? Because it invokes the demand for social policies to redress the problem, which is impossible. There are too many different kinds of people. First of all, maybe you work for gender parity or sex parity in terms of wages. Well, first of all, that's extraordinarily difficult. Just that, and that's a single dimension. You're going to do that for race, you're going to do that for ethnicity, you're going to do that for social class, you're going to do that for attractiveness, you're going to do that for the multitude of genders that apparently exist. You're going to equate for all of that?
But Jordan, I think you're making an assumption that this is what people want. Well,
they're the ones that are advocating for equity.
Who are?
Well, what do you mean, who are?
I don't know.
The entire basis of the social justice movement.
Who are these people?
Who are these people? Well, mostly they're people who occupy academic positions in the social sciences and the humanities. And they're people who work primarily in human resources departments, for example, in large corporations. And then there's a large swath of the general mainstream media who holds similar views. There are people who are on the farthest left extreme of the political continuum. It's only about 7% of the population that holds views of this type, although they're much more highly represented than that in university settings. And this is the agenda that they've promoted. So, maybe it's not the same in Holland, but the diversity, equity, and inclusivity mantra it's like the central policy of our entire federal government. It was the central policy of the provincial government before they got demolished, thankfully, in the last election. It's the new morality. It's not something I'm just inventing out of whole cloth. It's trumpeted everywhere. Christ, the Law Society in Ontario last year, the people who ran the Law Society made it a regulation that if you had a law firm of a certain size, and not that big, that you had to write a statement proclaiming your allegiance to the principles of diversity, inclusivity, and equity on pain of, well, it was unspecified at the point, but the eventual threat was loss of your legal license. Well, thankfully, this year, a woman spent 18 months garnering up a new slate of candidates to run the Ontario Law Society and chased all the radicals out of the organization, and hopefully they've scrapped the requirement. But it's pervasive in the elementary school curriculums. It's pervasive in the junior high school curriculums. It's taught in all of the gender and ethnic studies departments in the universities. It characterizes the viewpoints, as I said, of a substantial proportion of social scientists and humanities. There's almost no conservatives in the social sciences and the humanities. And if you had to boil down the cliches and slogans of their political viewpoint, that's it. That's what they've picked. Diversity, inclusivity, and equity. I've never even really been able to figure out what inclusivity means. It's such an ill-defined concept. I know what diversity means. It means representation by immutable biological quality. And equity is a weasel word that means equality of outcome. And that's exactly what people are aiming for. And they make no bones about it. So I don't see how it comes as a surprise that that's the fundamentally appropriate way of summing up that particular political viewpoint.
Well, I don't know exactly how this is in Canada, but in the Netherlands, if we have quotas or whatever, people are not as strict as you present them to be. They just want equal representation as far as possible. Just that the people who normally don't get a chance. Equal representation on what basis?
Oh, look, our Prime Minister, when in the last federal election, 27% of the MPs who were elected were women. 50% of the people in the cabinet were women. Now, how in the world? Two questions. A, how is that possibly fair? And B, how is it possible statistically that he picked the most competent people? It's statistically impossible.
How many people were there that he could choose from?
Hundreds.
It's hundreds, so then you still have a large enough pool.
Doesn't matter. It's a matter of pure proportion. If you have 75% of the people on one side of the room and 25% of the people on the other, and you pick the most competent people, you'll draw 3/4 of the people from the one side of the room and 1/4 from the other. It has nothing to do with the number of people.
Well, it could also be that those women worked harder to get there since they're more
obstacles. It could be, but it also
for them.
couldn't be. And without stringent evidence that was the case, I wouldn't make that assumption. Because I don't think that, first of all, 50% of women vote, or 50% of the people who can vote are women. And so if the women are interested in going into politics, which they seem to be less interested in, by the way, than men, then they have the opportunity to appeal to their gender to be elected. And I'm not going to accept the proposition that they had to work twice as hard to get where they wanted to go. Maybe they did, and maybe they didn't. And it's something that would be judged on an individual by individual case. And regardless of that, there's still absolutely no... Listen, I think that the women, the cabinet members, who took their cabinet positions who were women in the Trudeau federal government should be ashamed of themselves for the rest of their life for allowing themselves to be elevated to position of power based fundamentally on their genitalia. There's no excuse for it. If they had an ounce of pride, they would have rejected it and said, you pick the most competent people. That's your job. It's 2015, and so we have 50% women. It's like, no, these are important positions. We appoint the people who are the most competent for the job, and we do it independently of their fundamental biological nature. That's the whole point of an egalitarian society. And you say, well, women were oppressed in the past, so these women deserve a specific advantage. And in what possible manner is that just? It doesn't offer the people who were transgressed against any recourse because they're all dead. It offers the women who are being promoted now a completely unfair advantage, and not only that, makes anyone who has any sense whatsoever skeptical of their capabilities, because I'm skeptical of the capabilities of anyone who's promoted on any basis other than merit. And if you were promoted on any other basis than merit, you should be skeptical, A, of your ethical, what would you call, ethical justification for accepting the position, and also deep in your heart at 3 in the morning when you're wondering just how competent you are, you're going to be waking up thinking, just exactly why am I here? And am I so bloody sure that I didn't take the position of someone else who deserved it more? So, and also one of the consequences of that too is that the Trudeau government has pursued an exceptionally feminist agenda, and virtually every piece of legislation that they've run through their process so far has concentrated on such things as the wage gap in Canada, which, believe me, is not the most pressing problem we have in Canada by any stretch of the imagination. It wasn't even a bloody issue until the Trudeau government came into power. So no one was even talking about it, and it was working itself out at a very rapid rate. You know, and then the whole pay gap issue is complicated beyond belief, not least because, for example, women are much more likely to work part-time, and they're likely to work shorter hours. You work 10% more hours. Do you know how much more money you make?
Jordan,
40%. You make 40% more money if you work 10% more hours.
But I want to kind of, not go into all of these different things again. So competence. The issue, of course, is, as you know, you're a psychologist, that men often get jobs in power because they're better at presenting themselves as confident. There's
very little evidence for that. The best predictors of...
There's a whole book about
No,
this.
there is no evidence for that. The best predictors of being hired and being successful are intelligence as measured by IQ tests and conscientiousness as measured by the Big Five. There are tiny advantages to extroversion. There are tiny advantages to attractiveness. So it's not the case that men are better at whatever it is that takes for them to get hired at a particular job. And it's certainly not the case in most modern, high-level educated corporations. In the universities, for example, the evidence is crystal clear at the moment that if you're a female, especially in the STEM fields, your probability of being hired is overwhelmingly higher than a man with the same qualifications.
In that field, but I'm talking about powerful positions.
What about powerful positions?
There's the Dunning-Kruger effect, and you know about this, right?
Tell me the Dunning-Kruger effect.
The people who present as very confident, kind of narcissistic, are more likely to be believed by other people and to be judged as competent, even though there's no correlation between this overconfidence and actual...
Right, but it accounts for a very tiny part of the variance in the eventual outcome. We're not looking at 50% of what constitutes the probability that someone will be hired. We're looking at 2 or 3%. Look, IQ accounts for about 25% of your probability of being successful. So that leaves 75% unaccounted for. And conscientiousness accounts for another 10%. So the best two predictors together account for 45%. After that, the next best is neuroticism, and it's a negative predictor. And it only accounts for about 4%. And then these effects that you're talking about, they're trivial. They barely register. So they're certainly not accounting for the differential positioning of men and women in positions of power. And also, I would also take some exception to the conceptualization of those positions as positions of power. Because I would say that they're positions of competence and authority most of the time, unless you're talking about a tyrannical dictatorship. Because the people that I know who are CEOs and CFOs and who run C-suites aren't wandering around with a mace and a club and beating people into submission if they don't do their will. They're engaged in a very, very complex and sophisticated series of negotiations on a constant basis with all of their employees. And they bear a tremendous responsibility to ensure that their employees are satisfied and happy, because if they aren't, they leave and their companies fail. And the managerial evidence suggests as well that managers are far more stressed psychophysiologically by their subordinates than subordinates are by their managers. And that's partly because if you're a subordinate, you have one manager, and if you're a manager, you have 1,000 subordinates. And so it's very difficult. And so to call those positions of power, it's like, well, sometimes they are. But they're not just positions of power. First of all, power is an unstable way of establishing a hierarchy. It doesn't even work for chimps. Positions of authority, positions of competence, positions of responsibility.
Okay, let's
well,
stop that.
But it makes a difference. Men occupy positions of power. First of all, no, most men don't. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage. Second, why power? Why use that word? Well, it's simple. It's a derivation from a Marxist philosophy that's 150 years old, that people bandy about without ever thinking about it. You know, the people I know, seriously, the people I know who have positions of power, like they're terrified constantly that their companies are going to fall apart, or that they're not serving their employees properly, or that they're not going to make the next payroll, or that some technological transformation is going to cut their legs out from underneath them. They're not sitting in a money bin like Scrooge McDuck, throwing their coinage up in the air and triumphantly, what would you call, trumpeting their superiority to the rest of the human race. They're not interested in having slaves. They're interested in having collaborators. They're interested in mentoring people. And they're ambitious. Many of them are actually trying to accomplish important and difficult things rather than merely trying to occupy the power positions that the postmodernists love to identify. They're doing things, you know, and it's the fact that they're doing things that are giving them the positions, at least in a company that functions. When the company starts to deteriorate, and that happens very frequently, you know, and degenerate into something that's more tyrannical, then the political types who work fundamentally on power and intimidation have a chance to clamber up to the top. But by the time that's happening, the company is so damn dead, it's probably only got a lifespan of about 10 years.
Okay. Second point against this issue of people in powerful positions. Now, there are certain positions that are so important because they represent the society, like these MPs, the ministers, also judges, which are predominantly female now in the Netherlands. Wouldn't it be better to have a more equal division between men and women in those positions? Well,
it's certainly possible that it would be better. I don't know whether it would be better or not. It might be better. It could be better. It's certainly worth the experiment, but that doesn't mean that it's better to establish that by quota or by insisting on equality of outcome, because you don't know what the determinants are of equality of outcome. You know, it may be, for all you know, it might be in 20 years that 75% of the judges are women. I mean, it's happening very rapidly in all the fields that have to do with primary human care, which is also part of the reason that women's salaries are lower, because you can't scale human care. You know, if you're a computer programmer and you make a computer program, and then you can make 1 million of them. If you're a nurse, there's like you you know, and so some things are very difficult to scale. And it's going to be the case that in many disciplines, women predominate. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I have no idea, and neither does anyone else. You know, I mean, and I wrestle with it to some degree. Almost all the elementary school teachers are women. Well, is that a good thing? Well, it's good in that the women chose to be elementary school teachers and they got to follow their free choice. And so to the degree that following your free choice in a free society is a good thing, that's a good thing. Is it good for the children to only be exposed to one gender while they're being educated at such a young age? I don't know. Those are separate questions. But things are sorting themselves out quite quickly. And they're not going to sort out at 50-50. And then, so what are we going to do about that? We're going to decide that some professions should be 50-50. So that would be the C-suites, because that's where the feminists concentrate. Half the corporate executives have to be female. But they don't say that about the damn bricklayers. It's 99% of bricklayers are men. Almost all heavy machinery operators. Almost all construction workers.
Now, of course, it's about the positions of power, like judges and like MPs.
Well, power, you know, power, that's one way of thinking about it. But, like, why is it any more relevant that women are underrepresented, let's say, in the C-suites than that they're underrepresented among bricklayers?
You know the answer to
No,
this.
I don't know the answer to that. If the goal is 50-50 representation, because women have been systemically, what would you call, they've been systemically excluded from trades and occupations. How do you possibly draw the line between those positions where gender equity should be pursued and those positions where it shouldn't? It's not possible. And I defy you to make an argument for why 50% of the bricklayers shouldn't be women. Why is that not just as unjust, let's say, as the fact that a smaller percentage of women occupy C-suite positions?
Well, C-suite, I'm not concerned about. I'm concerned about the MPs and the judges right now.
Same
and
thing.
they are representing. Bricklayers are not representing.
High-level professional positions. Then we'll go with that.
Now let's go for the MPs and the judges.
Well, they're elected or appointed. We have mechanisms for determining this already. You don't put quotas in place. There's no excuse for quotas. Because we don't know how this is going to play out.
That's your main concern, that you don't know how it's going to play out.
Well, first of all, you don't put quotas in if you don't have an equal pipeline, that's for sure. If there's 50% one sex of candidate and 50% the other, well, at least if there were quotas, you would be sampling randomly from the talent within the two populations. But if there's 10% women and 90% men, and you pick 50% of your candidates from the women, then you've picked a bad lot of candidates, statistically speaking. And not just a little bit bad. And you see, this sort of thing makes a tremendous difference, because the difference in competence between people isn't linear, it's non-linear. And so if you start to populate disciplines with substandard people who aren't competent, then you destroy the disciplines. And that happens very rapidly. It's certainly happened to many disciplines in the universities.
You think that's happened to the government?
Here? Our government's pretty stable, and you know it takes a hell of a fool to ruin it in 4 years. You know, most Western democracies have a lot of different checks and balances in place. You know, and in Canada we have a federal system, and so the provinces have a fair bit of power. And as the Liberals rose to ascendancy, I hate to call them Liberals because they're far left of what the traditional Liberals in Canada were, because they were always centrists. What's happened is that the provincial parties have become increasingly conservative. And so Canada manages to maintain a pretty decent balance of political viewpoints, I would say. And so I'm not worried to any great degree that Trudeau has done any long-term substantive damage to the Canadian political structure as such, although I think his policies have devastated Western Canada, just like his father's policies did. and that was incredibly ill-advised and is going to cause an immense amount of trouble over the next 5 or 6 years. But, you know, there's not more than a moderate chance that he's going to survive the October election anyways, depending on how foolish the Conservatives are as they attempt to oust him and how divisive their own internal politics become. So, you know, our Western countries are pretty stable. They have a lot of moving parts that tend to keep them on a relatively even keel. So I don't think the situation is dire, especially by historical standards. Worse things have happened. I think that he's been extraordinarily divisive as a leader. I do believe that the relationship between Indigenous people in Canada and the rest of the population is far worse than it was when he first took office, and is likely to become worse yet, because the drum is continually being beaten and the fundamental problems are not being addressed. The fundamental problems are like unbelievably difficult to address, and no one has the courage to do it.
Let's then go to your opinion about this missing and murdered Indigenous women report. What's your opinion?
Well, first of all, to consider that a genocide is it's like a criminal use of terminology as far as I'm concerned, because genocide has a very specific meaning as far as I'm concerned. It's state or police, army, militia, planned militia eradication of specific populations for the purpose of eradicating them. Everyone knows that. That's not what's happening in Canada. What's happening is that there's an underclass of Indigenous Canadians who suffer for an endless plethora of reasons. Isolation, especially in northern communities, which have no hope of economic survival, no more than non-Indigenous northern communities have hope of economic survival. All the small towns in Canada have died. All the small towns in Europe are threatened. The French can't keep their small towns running, neither can the Italians. They're beautiful and ancient. They can't even keep them going. We have these little places that were scraped out of the bloody frost 50 years ago that were barely functional when they first started. They've all died. Thousands of these towns have died in places like Saskatchewan. You can't keep tiny reserves going in the north. It's completely impossible. And the rates of alcoholism are through the roof. The same with drug use, and it's no bloody wonder. It's frigid and dark 6 months of the year, and there's very little to do. Plus, there's no future. And so, you know, people migrate from those places to the city and they get themselves in all sorts of trouble. And there's plenty of willing people to aid them in their catastrophes. And to consider that a genocide is, it's a form of false, it's a form of extortionary false compassion. It's extortion because it requires anybody who objects to the use of the term to present themselves as uncaring. And it's inappropriate because the reason that there are thousands of missing Indigenous women, and plenty, by the way, missing Indigenous men, is because of a dozen reasons, all extraordinarily complicated, and none of which are being managed properly. I would say probably alcoholism being the number one contributor. It's a very intractable problem in small communities. It's a very dangerous drug. 50% of the people who are killed are drunk. 50% of the people who commit the murders are drunk. Your highest risk of death is drunk family member. Right? Alcohol is a very, very toxic drug, and it does terrible things to people. It impairs their judgment very badly. And so, and the problem of alcoholism is widespread, not only among the Indigenous community, but in isolated northern communities in general. But it's not like anybody knows what to do about it. It's a very difficult problem to solve. And I lived in an isolated northern community. It's no bloody wonder people drink themselves half to death for 6 months of the year. You know, it's cold, bitterly cold, it's bloody dark, and there isn't anything to do. And the communities don't have a future. So, you know, under those circumstances, people turn to alternative forms of hedonic pleasure. And it's not surprising. But genocide requires a perpetrator. So the question is, who exactly here is being identified as the perpetrator? And the second is, exactly why are they being identified as the perpetrator? And I know perfectly well the answer to the second part of that question, which is that it's very convenient for the ideologues who are underwriting the more extreme elements of these documents to make yet another case for the oppressive colonial patriarchy and to lay the responsibility at the feet of people who aren't them. So there's no excuse for it. Now, and that doesn't mean there isn't a problem. There's a problem. The relationship between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people in Canada is unstable, and it's not improving. But we don't know what to do about it. You know, I've been working with a native carver for 10 years, 15 years. I made friends with him when I went to Vancouver Island. I've been buying his artwork since then. And he carved a 53-foot totem pole that's in front of the Montreal Museum of Fine Art that commemorated the residential schools. He was a residential school survivor, and he had a childhood that was so brutal that it's almost unimaginable. It's unimaginable. That's good enough. If you heard it, you'd be suffering for the tale for a few days. And he had his slice of hell, and that's for sure. And, you know, I've done everything I could, along with a friend of mine, not to help him, because that's not the right way of thinking about it, but to engage in useful, mutual, productive trade so that he has an opportunity to pursue his livelihood and so that I'm a beneficiary of what it is that he produces. And his circumstances are so complex that for every step he takes forward, the probability that he'll slide back at least one is almost 100%. It's family catastrophes, continual deaths, alcohol-fueled familial breakup, chronic divorce, fetal alcohol syndrome, multiple patterns of drug use, abuse on a widespread scale of men, women, and children, fragmented culture. It's very, 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 very difficult to make headway in a situation like that. And to come out with a report that says, well, this is a consequence of genocide is to take your own political conviction and hold that as your a priori axiom, and then to take all the facts that you can muster and line them up behind what you already knew so well, instead of taking the problem apart in all its hopelessness and trying painstakingly, incrementally, piece by piece, to slowly address some of the underlying issues. It's a very difficult thing to do.
So there's something that I find difficult to understand about you as a phenomenon, and that's that you're against polarization, but yet you call your opponents, like the postmodern feminists, the social justice warriors, you compare them to Nazis and to fascists.
No, I haven't compared them to Nazis.
You say they're like Marxists, and Marxists are just as bad as Nazis.
That's true, but I didn't compare them to Nazis. I compared them to Marxists.
Which are just as bad as Nazis.
Well, at the ethical level, yes, but it doesn't mean that they're the same they have the same political stripe. I don't like people who play group identity politics. They're promoting tribalism. Tribal societies are extraordinarily dangerous. And I think they're doing it primarily because of resentment. I certainly don't trust the Marxism, and why would I? I mean, how is it, you tell me after 150 million deaths, how it's okay to be a Marxist.
Yeah, but that's not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is the type of language you're using to qualify your opponents. It seems polarizing as well.
It depends on the opponents. I don't like Marxists. It isn't that I don't like them. There's no excuse for it. You call me polarizing if I objected to Nazis? Yes or no? If I objected to Nazis, am I polarizing or not?
But you see these people who want the gender-neutral pronouns. That's basically their main point. You see them...
That's their claimed main point.
But you think they're actually more dangerous than this?
It isn't that I think they're more dangerous than this. I know they're more dangerous than this. They wouldn't have put in compelled speech legislation if they weren't more dangerous than that.
Well, they would say, we don't want discrimination.
Yes, that's what they would say. But they still put in compelled speech legislation. And that never happened before in the history of British common law. And as I already pointed out, the American Supreme Court made it illegal in 1942. You can compel speech commercially. If you sell tobacco, you can make people put a warning on their package. You cannot tell people in the United States what they have to say. It's not constitutional. Okay. Now you can do it in Canada.
But Jordan,
I don't appreciate that.
Jordan, you are all about taking responsibility for your actions. And then when I see already in our team also, we've had these really fierce discussions about things that you were saying. And there was already a schism in the team. So it seems like you are somehow a polarizing influence. And that concerns me, and I wonder if that concerns you too.
Well, of course it concerns me. The question is, what's the alternative? I've got no patience for Marxists. There's no excuse for it. There's no more excuse for it than there is for being a Nazi, in my estimation. And now maybe you should say, well, I should have patience for Nazis, but I don't.
Of course, that's not what I'm saying.
No, but it's not so clear that it's not what you're saying.
No,
because it is the Marxists that I'm objecting to. And it's somehow it's okay to be a Marxist. Because maybe you're for the poor, even though you're not. I don't think it's okay to be a Marxist. I don't even think it's a little bit okay to be a Marxist. I think maybe in 1918, when you didn't know any better, even though wise people had already warned against the danger for at least 50 years, then maybe you could have assumed that you would bring in the utopia with your ideas of equity. But it's 100 years later, and we've seen the carnage.
But you really see these people as the same thing as the Marxist, the Stalinist
they
Marxists.
Call themselves Marxists. No, they're worse than the Stalinist Marxists. Because the Stalinist Marxists didn't know who Stalin was going to be. And we know who Stalin was, and we know who Mao was, and we know who Pol Pot was.
So let's make this clear. You really think that these people who are battling for social justice, against discrimination, that they want some sort of Stalinist regime?
Well, they wouldn't say that. No, of course they wouldn't say that. Their policies would lead inevitably to it. And God only knows what they want in their heart of hearts. You know, it's the postmodern neo-Marxist types who are always on about power. Every structure is predicated on power. Well, first of all, that's not true. But if you make that claim, then you have to ask, well, why exactly is it that you're claiming that every structure is based on power? What exactly does that have to do with your own motivations if you happen to be embedded in a structure? Does that mean, what, are you somehow immune to that if it's the only game in town? Or is it exactly what you're pursuing? And so, you know, it's not like all the people who started the Russian Revolution wanted a bloody nightmare, but that's what they got. And there was a certain proportion of them who were perfectly happy with that outcome too. And so, no, I don't trust them. So, and I especially don't trust them because they're in a much better historical position to understand the consequences of their doctrines than people were 60 years ago or 100 years ago. Far better. We had the experiments. We ran them. Multiple countries. Multiple economic conditions. And the same thing always happened. It was a complete bloody catastrophe.
So this goes for contemporary feminism. You think it's that dangerous?
There's lots of different kinds of feminism. There's enough different kinds of feminism, so I'm not even sure what the term means. The feminists can't agree. They can't even have a women's march together without fragmenting into four warring factions. So if feminism means equity, then I'm not in favor of it. If it means equality of opportunity, well, more power to them as far as I'm concerned. But usually it means something more radical, which is why the vast majority of women do not identify as feminists.
Oh.
So
the majority does identify as feminist if you look at if they are given an actual definition of feminism, but
it depends on the poll. Let's put it that way.
Let's put it that way. Yeah.
It depends. Of course, it matters if it depends on the definition. Just like it matters whether or not I'm a feminist, whether it depends on the definition.
Would you ever consider?
If it's a matter of equality of opportunity, then I'm a feminist. If it's a matter of equality of outcome, then no. So I have a daughter. It's not like I didn't encourage her to be everything that she could be. She's really quite something. You know, she's nobody's fool. She's no pushover. She's a tough cookie. And that's in large part a consequence of encouragement. I have a wife. I've had many female colleagues, many female graduate students. I've worked with women my whole entire life attempting to improve their career trajectories, and with plenty of success. And so I'd say my feminist credentials are beyond question. But that doesn't make me a Marxist. And I don't like ideologues, because they don't like to think. They just like to think that they're right, and they're not right, because things are a lot more complicated than they appear to be. They get together in their coteries and they pat themselves on the back for having unidimensional solutions to incredibly complex problems. And they go home and think that they've done something positive to change the world. And there's none of that's work, none of that's effort, none of that changes anything. So I'm not impressed with ideologues.
Let's make it once again very clear what you mean, what you are against. So equality of outcome, ideologues, what exactly is it?
Equality of outcome will do.
Yeah.
Well, and anything that smacks of Marxism.
Yeah, but Marxism, of course, you can also define that in various ways.
No, basically Marxism is the hypothesis that human history is the battleground between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, so that human history is best conceptualized as a continual battle between those who have and those who don't.
But we're now talking within feminism?
Well, it's changed into identity politics, so it's just switched from economic power to other forms of power. It's the same damn thing.
Okay, so
and the problem with that too is that there's an infinite division of privileges. So one of the things I found out about the Russian Revolution,
Please, Jordan, let's not go into the Russian Revolution, but just
well, it's important,
what it is within. I know.
You asked about equity.
Yeah.
Okay, how many identities do you have? Do you think? Let's say 10. Okay, you're an oppressor on at least 2 of them. You're white.
Yeah. And middle class.
Okay, good, 2. So when the revolution comes, you can have your 8 dimensions of victimization and your 2 dimensions of oppression. And you can bloody well be sure that you'll be punished for the oppression and not rewarded for the victimization. And that is what happened in the Russian Revolution. And it's an inevitable consequence of those sorts of policies. Because you can fragment people's identities to the point where you find where they're the oppressor. And as soon as they're the oppressor, even for one reason, then they're the enemy. And if you happen to be the sort of person who enjoys collecting enemies, let's say, and there's plenty of people like that, then one reason that you're the enemy is more than sufficient.
Okay, so it's identity politics within feminism that troubles you.
It's the presumption that the fundamental hallmark of human identity is the group. That's wrong. It's not only wrong, it's far worse than wrong. It's retrogressive, it's tribalistic, it's dangerous, it's an incitement to violence, it's resentful, and it's malevolent. All of those things. So, no group identity politics. We got it right in the West. The sovereignty of the individual. And the reason for that is Each of us is a sufficiently complex nexus of individual group identities so that we have to be treated as unique individuals. That's the ultimate lesson of intersectionality, if only the intersectionalists had enough sense to think it through, which they don't.
So actually, you're a real intersectionalist feminist then?
With friends like me, they don't need enemies.
Yeah.
Look, there's no reason that the human race shouldn't take advantage of the talents of every woman on the planet. It's foolish otherwise. One of the best predictors of economic growth in any country is the degree to which women are granted rights, right? It's a great predictor, which is extraordinarily interesting. And why we would waste half the talent? Who in their right mind would possibly do that? So I've got no problem with providing people with a plethora of opportunity. The more the better. But the oppression narrative, the group identity, the insistence that structures of authority and competence are only predicated on power, all of that is toxic and dangerous.
Now this to me seems like a different thing from what you were saying before, and it's just in the manner that you're expressing yourself now. I think it's much clearer now what you are actually against, and how you see these male-female dynamics.
Well, the funny thing is that I'm not so much against. You know, when I do my, this is why interviews are so strange. Mm-hmm. When I do my lectures, I don't talk politically. I'm not against things. I'm for individual people. Individual people. So get out there, do your best, tell the truth, set the world in order, have a family, accept some responsibility, fix up your community, and take the beam out of your own eye before you worry about the mote in your neighbors.
Yeah. And I like that part of 12 rules and of everything that you're saying. But then there seems to be this other side, or it comes out in interviews sometimes, but it's also in 12 rules, where you equate the feminine with chaos.
I don't do that. No, that's ridiculous. I know. The Taoists have done that for 3,000 years.
I know, but
right, it's not me.
No.
Right.
But you're selecting, right? You write a book, which is an antidote to chaos, and you're selecting the stories in which the feminine is chaos, and also I'm
observing and collecting the stories.
But it's adding up, right? So you also talk about the importance of the Bible, in which women are deemed subservient.
No, they're not. That's complete rubbish. How in the world could you possibly derive that idea from biblical readings? The most fundamental statement in the Bible, and this is a miraculous statement, it's absolutely incomprehensible that it was written some thousands of years ago. Men and women are made in the image of God. Not men. Men and women.
But you know that there's also passages in there which do posit the woman as subservient.
What passages are you referring to?
Well, where it's told to Adam and Eve that women will henceforth have to obey their husband.
Well, that wasn't what would you say? That wasn't a divine injunction. It was a terrible warning.
Okay,
it wasn't a statement about how society should be structured. It was a statement about the inevitability of that happening because women were going to be vulnerable in pregnancy and in child raising.
Now I understand your interpretation. You're interpreting the Bible and you're interpreting Nietzsche and bringing it all together. It's fine that you're doing that in your way, but can you understand that to women it may feel like you are against them?
What do you mean? It may feel to women like there's no injunction in that story.
No, but
that men have the right to lord it over women. No, it's not in the story.
It's not just this story, of course. You know,
But what is it? There's heroic females in the entire corpus of the Old Testament. And there's no evidence whatsoever throughout the biblical corpus that women are any less worthy of the kingdom of God than men. And so this is part of the same thing. There's the pervasive notion that even the fundamental documents of Western civilization have this inbuilt patriarchal bias. Look, as far as I'm concerned, that statement that men and women are both made in the image of God, which gives them each a spark of divinity, out of that tiny little statement grew the entire idea of individual human rights. The idea that the state couldn't impose its purview past a certain limit, and that idea grew over thousands of years to provide the relatively free society that we have now. And to assume that is associated in some manner with patriarchal oppression, especially given the time when that was written, is just think about how unlikely it was that long ago those words were penned.
But Jordan, please listen to the question that I'm trying to pose, and it's not about this, it's about everything adding up, and that makes women feel that somehow you are against them. And wait a minute before you answer, because you're all about taking responsibility, and that it's very important to look at the consequences of what we do. And somehow a lot of women feel like you're against them. So what's going on there? What's your responsibility here?
You have no evidence whatsoever of what proportion of the people who are watching my videos or listening to my podcasts or reading my books who are women feel that way. Your accusations are purely speculative.
It's not. It's not an accusation.
Sure,
it's just an observation. It was
but an observation based on what?
Well,
I have women I have dozens of women, hundreds of women who've written me letters thanking me for the books and for what they've done for their sons and for their husbands. And about 30% of the audiences to my shows are now women, and that's increasing as a consequence of the book.
Of course.
So I don't buy it.
Not all women.
Yeah, well, there's a small and unspecified percentage of women who may hold the perspective that you describe. But you have no idea what the percentage is, and you have no hard facts on it, and so there's no way of defending myself against it. And the idea that I happen to identify the feminine with chaos why is that a problem? Chaos is no worse than order. Order is tyranny. Chaos is possibility. The mere fact that people don't do a close enough reading to understand that these two powers are equally balanced, in that order can be security or tyranny, and that chaos can be potential or uncertainty. The fact that people aren't reading carefully enough to understand that is not my problem. They could read it carefully enough to understand that. And to say that that's a fabrication on my part is absolutely foolish. I mean, for 40 years, let's say the mystic left has been enamored of the Taoist philosophy. Well, the philosophy that I'm putting forward is the Taoist philosophy. So how in the world can that be laid at my feet? And it's certainly not the only example of the symbolic utilization of masculinity for order. Look at it this way. Why do you think the feminists assume that we live in a patriarchy if they're not identifying masculinity with order? That's what they're doing. Well, they're doing it symbolically. They don't understand. It's a symbolic issue.
Yeah, but Jordan, you've been asked this question before, but I didn't think your answer, I wasn't quite convinced yet. Your book is an antidote to chaos, and not an antidote to chaos and order, or not.
The next book's an antidote to order.
Yeah, it will be an antidote to order.
And the book isn't an antidote. The book is the antidote to chaos is not order.
No.
Right, that's not what the book's about. The antidote to chaos is the balance between order and chaos, right? And the book says that repeatedly. It's impossible to read it and actually read it and not to come away with the conclusion that the position that I'm adopting is that the meaningful place to stand in life is halfway in order and halfway in chaos. It's not a criticism of chaos, and it's not a criticism of order, except in the extremes. And the extremes are terrible in both directions, which is why the balance has to be there. And so I'm not saying we replace female chaos with male order. First of all, I'm not saying that chaos is female. I said it was symbolically feminine. And that's not the same thing at all. It's not even close to the same thing, because there's a difference between a symbol and something that's real. And because we have a gendered cognitive structure, we tend to view the world through gendered categories. And that's the categories that emerged. And that's not my responsibility. It's just how it is. And it's certainly not me that came up with that idea.
So, tomorrow we're meeting with Margaret Atwood. What do you think of her? Have you read The Handmaid's Tale?
I haven't read The Handmaid's Tale. I've read other books of Margaret Atwood. I think she's exactly what you'd expect from a Torontonian middle-class feminist writer.
And what is that? What would you expect?
I'm not a fan.
Why not?
I don't like her books. Why? Well, I don't have a more elaborated description of that. I've read 3 or 4 of them years ago when I was an undergraduate. The Edible Woman particularly springs to mind. I don't share her ethos.
And what is that ethos?
It's, I would say, rather, it's complicated. It's a Canadian ethos in some sense. There's an undercurrent of complacent and self-righteous ideological feminism that grates on my nerves. I don't think of her writings as literature, particularly. I think about them as a relatively sophisticated form of propaganda that a particular kind of educated Canadian is particularly susceptible to.
Propaganda
I like
for
Margaret
what?
Lawrence.
I know, yeah. But propaganda
She
for
wrote
what?
The Stone Angel. For the kind of worldview that we've been talking about, the general worldview, the oppression narrative. I mean, The Handmaid's Tale is a good example of that. So,
oppression of
women.
Okay, so you would not like to meet
It's
her.
not like women aren't oppressed. I mean, we've already made that perfectly clear. You know, it's that people are oppressed. And it's a lot more important to remember that than it is to remember that women are oppressed. So, and I don't know if it's that useful to have an oppression race. I don't find it productive, especially given how horrible most people's lives actually were and how much better they are now and how ungrateful we are for that.
Okay. So you would not like to meet Margaret Atwood?
I have met her in an elevator.
No. And?
Oh, well, this was quite a long time ago. Well, I said hello and was polite. I don't have anything against her personally. I mean, and more power to her. She's been very successful and brought Canadian literature a much broader world market. And, you know, she's a talented person and obviously very diligent. But I don't find her philosophy attractive. It doesn't compel me. I don't find it uplifting or encouraging or profound, for that matter. So that might have something to do with being from the West, I suppose.
Yeah.
You know, well, she was part of the Toronto establishment, and the Toronto establishment was never really all that popular in Western Canada. So, you know, maybe it's a regional thing to some degree. I don't hold her any ill will, although I have to admit that I wasn't entirely dissatisfied when the feminists who she happened to annoy last year took their piece of flesh from her on Twitter.
In the Me Too.
Yes, well, you know, be careful about what sort of children you give birth to. That's what I would say about that.
What sort of children you give? Oh, okay.
Precisely.
You think that she's part of the feminist movement
that created those creatures? Yes, definitely. And no doubt about it. And they showed her no mercy. And that's because that's about how much mercy they're capable of.
Okay.
So
then my final question to you. This is the larger question that we're exploring in this series. Whether and to what extent Canada is the last fortress of civilization?
God, let's hope not. No, I don't believe that, not in the least. It's a pretty good country. We have good British institutions, and thank God for that. They're in a bit of conflict with the less good French institutions, in my estimation, because I think the English common law system is far superior to the French civil law system. I think it's demonstrated that repeatedly. It's a good place. You know, people get along. We have high rates of immigration here, in Toronto, for example, and I would say that it's improved the city. Quite to my amazement. It's a very difficult thing to manage. I don't know how we do it. Seems to work. People here are relatively well off. We're all compressed into the middle class. You know, it's not like the United States with this, because it's a much smaller country, of course, with the massive extremes that you see there of good and bad and poverty and wealth.
It's a little bit more socialist here.
It is. It has a wider safety net, which actually increases the rate of entrepreneurial activity, interestingly enough, because people are more likely to start businesses. So that's kind of an interesting thing. The healthcare system, for a system that's attempting to do something that's absolutely impossible, does not too badly. I don't think it is worse than the American system. I don't think it's as good at the top end, but it's certainly much better at the bottom end. But there's plenty of places in the world that are bastions of civilization. Not enough of them, but more, maybe more all the time. You know, there is some evidence for that. I don't think that we're any better off or any better ethically or from a governmental perspective than 20 countries you could easily name: Australia, New Zealand, the UK, although the UK has its troubles at the moment, France. I think the Netherlands is a wonderful country. I think you people have created a country that's a complete bloody miracle, especially given that it's actually underwater, you know, which is, I suppose, one of the things that's kept you rather awake. The Scandinavian countries, most European countries, even Eastern Europe, is showing signs of life again. You know, there's no wars in the Western Hemisphere right now. It's possible, especially as the drug wars start to calm down, that we'll get a bit more civilization out of South and Central America. That would be nice. But I don't see Canada as a particularly special nation, outside of that group of countries that I named.
And why was your first reaction, good God, not Canada is the last fortress of civilization?
Oh, because I just don't think it's true. You know, it's not that desperate. I mean, there's no shortage of civilization in the United States. It's an amazing country. It's unbelievably diverse. It's unbelievably powerful. And their political system is actually, despite what everybody thinks, working quite well. I think it might be working better than any other political system in the West, because there's a pretty good balance between the opposing viewpoints. You know, there's no one's clearly got the upper hand. And that's kind of nice. It's more polarized than it has been, but no more than under Nixon. You know, the Nixon years weren't particularly peaceful, and the years under Reagan weren't either. So we've seen this sort of thing before. But Canada is a fine place, and we're fortunate to live here, and people are fortunate to come here, and hopefully we'll have enough bloody sense to maintain it, and enough good fortune. And, you know, it's becoming an old democracy. by world standards, 150 years old. It's actually not that new a country as far as countries go. And we muddle through. We've managed to keep ourselves intact despite a couple of very close calls with regards to Quebec separatism, which would have been a real catastrophe. And that threat seems to have receded, I would say, permanently. And we do a pretty good job of bringing people together from all over the world and having them live peacefully. You know, there's no real ghettos in Toronto. There's no dangerous areas of note, you know, like there are places that are perhaps somewhat less safe than other places, and Montreal's like that too. And Vancouver's a good city. We have 3 really good cities and some other up-and-comers. You know, hopefully we'll have the wisdom and good sense to keep our country thriving, just as you will in the Netherlands, with any luck, because you have a great country.
Do you see yourself as a typical Canadian?
Typical? I don't think that that's a word that's very usefully applied to me, much to my discomfort. So I'm not exactly sure how I would characterize myself. So.
But you're not one of the apology culture that's so Canadian.
No, I'm not an apologist for the West. Every human history is a complete bloody catastrophe, and every nation has its sins and its advantages, and to the degree that we can rectify our past mistakes, good for us, and to the degree that we can capitalize on what we've accomplished, good for us. But like, what are you going to compare the West to? Where else would you live? Where else has it been better? That doesn't mean it's perfect. It doesn't mean we're without our historical errors. But little gratitude along with the judgment goes a long way. And I don't see the people who are criticizing the structure of Western civilization emigrating en masse to Saudi Arabia, let's say.
Okay, Jordan Peterson, thank you very much.
Thank you.